As I said, last week we began a discussion of the yamas and niyamas, and I was focusing last week mostly on the topic of the yamas. And I want to, like we did last week, I would like to invite your questions. Last week, the questions were should have been toward the yamas, but I would like to now speak a little bit more about the niyamas. And if you have questions, please address your questions of those topics because I'm going to cycle back to discuss the yamas and some of the aspects, but I want to go through the basic overview of the various qualities embodied in this topic. And then I'll come back and a little bit randomly perhaps, and discuss other aspects of them in the future. So we're going to be on this topic this week and also next week. The so I do invite your questions. Keep them focused on that. And I was thinking about this. I sent out a topic suggestion, as I try to do every week, on the topic of discussion today, and the thought came into my mind of why be virtuous. I mean, in a sense, we're speaking about yamas, things we, the things we shouldn't do, the non things, and also when we come to the yamas, the things we should do, proscriptions and prescriptions. And the question comes up, why should I do this? Now, obviously, if we understand yoga, we understand Raja Yoga and this Eightfold Path of Patanjali, the Ashtanga Yoga, we realize, okay, there's a goal to this and we want to achieve that goal. And so, okay, these are, you might say, some of the rules to be able to achieve that. But we have to realize this is a condensation. There are many virtues. There are many things that could have potentially, perhaps, could have phrased these interdependent qualities which covered so much of our life. He could have phrased it perhaps in other ways because there are many, many virtues or ways to express these same virtues. And we might ask the question, why do these things? It's just not a means to an end. I like to think that, and we should think of it this way, that virtue is its own reward. We don't act, or unfortunately, we do act sometimes, well, I'm going to act in a certain way because there's a benefit that comes from that. I see a benefit to myself, and we think, and you might say, a little bit of a commercial sense. I'm going to do good because if I do good, people will like me. And if people like me and I do good, then I'm going to be prosperous in this world and I'll be happier. And so it gives some end result that is positive. And so we act in that way. And there's that little subtle thought in there. Well, that's fine. But we also come to the point where we realize that virtue is its own reward. In the very act of behaving in a certain way, in perfection, in a perfected manner, we begin to experience bliss within ourselves. We begin to experience the joy that comes from truthfulness, for example, or as you might say in one of the niyamas, contentment. Contentment is its own reward because bliss comes as part of that. And the removal of all resistance and negativity and restlessness, this in and of itself is joy inducing. And so consequently, goodness is its own reward. Kindness is its own reward, as just in the very practice of it, we benefit in the immediacy. And I think we need to realize this. It's not because sometimes we approach virtue with a bit of, we see it as I guess I better be virtue. It's a chore. You might say, I have to be good today. And a child might think of this as, it's because they think their natural propensity is to get into mischief. But then they have to resist that. And this brings us to the topic of the niyamas. And traditionally, the niyamas begin with a discussion of the first one as being cleanliness or perhaps better stated as purity. But I'm going to actually start with one of the others, because there's this element of tapasya, which is traditionally comes third of the 5 niyamas. The element of tapasya is embodied in all of the yamas and the niyamas, because in the sense, tapasya, classically, people think of tapasya as austerities. I'm going to do something that maybe is a little bit difficult, something that's going to be a method of self-discipline, some action of self-discipline. There's a tradition of sitting in a surrounding oneself with little fires. You're in the middle of that fire on a hot day in the sun, to be able to be calm and resist the heat or the difficulty. Or you could do the same with cold. Tummo yoga, where you try to dry in the freezing weather. You put a wet sheet about your body and generate heat within the body to be able to dry that sheet. And these are austerities that yogis might do, some yogis might do to strengthen themselves, strength of mind, all of these sorts of things, which it takes some strength. It takes lots of strength, self-discipline, to be able to accomplish what we're trying to achieve on the spiritual path. But of course, there's an implication in tapasya of grimness, you might say, or stress, or all that discipline that comes with that. And it's not often approached in a joyful manner. But I think it's good for us to understand that everything in the spiritual path is, to some degree, embodies tapasya. Because tapasya is, you might say, the resistance to the natural flow of the creation of this relative world in which we find ourselves. And if we take that thought back, God created this universe. Why? And the mechanism of that is beyond our understanding. But in this creative process, there's a flow from perfect unity into the relative world of duality that we find ourselves in this creation. It's a descent, it's said, a descending from perfection into, you might say, imperfection, duality being imperfect compared to perfect oneness. And that descent into creation is what we're trying to reverse in the process of ascending. You see that ascending the ladder back up from this duality, this world of suffering, as sometimes it's described, back up into perfectness. And so there's an ascent. And so there's implied in that ascent, there's implied effort. There's implied effort. It takes effort to go up. And tapasya is that practice that resists that tendency, that natural flow of creation of Maya to descend, you might say, consciousness going out from perfect oneness within ourselves, out into ego consciousness, which is the soul identified with the body, and we experience the world through the senses. Now, we are in the process of yoga trying to reverse that journey back inward and upward to draw our energy inward and uplift that energy to the brain. But there is a tendency embedded within creation to flow outward into the world. The world wouldn't exist without that. If, there's an old story that is told that about God creating this universe, and God was sitting in solitary unity. And of course, this is just a story, but and he decides to create, and he manifests this world, and the first man in the world is there, and the first man awakens in the world and looks around and says, interesting, and then goes into deep samadhi and goes back. into oneness. And God does this once or twice more. And each time the created being looks about, not interested, and goes back. And so he has to figure out a way to keep mankind engaged. So he creates Maya, delusion, to make this world appealing. And of course, this is a story, but this world is very appealing. There's an attraction to the world, and there's a natural attraction to our energy outward into the world through the senses. Now, if we take this as a natural process, it's a state of the way the world is, attraction toward Maya, attraction toward delusion. Because it's like the carrot in front of the donkey hanging in front of we're always reaching for that carrot, but we never quite get it, you see. Sisyphus in the Greek mythology pushing that rock up to the top of the hill, and he never quite gets there. And he always, or Zeno crossing the road halfway, and he never crosses the road. Well, tapasya is to resist that impulse to go out. It's resistance. And we resist it, and it's a temperament to approach to life to have that, a little bit of resisting that creative flow outward into Maya. And in order to do that, it's what happens. It's like when something is resisted, it generates heat. And the word tapasya is my understanding. If the etymology in the Sanskrit of that, one of the root words of tapasya means heat. And it's in other words, resistance, heat, friction. And you're resisting that impulse, and the creations flow out into Maya. And we have to have, to some degree, we have to have tapasya to realize, hey, when the senses call or when delusion calls, we just don't go with our likes and dislikes or whims, our fancies as Master said, but we have to put up some blockage to that and resist it. And of course, we then take it, and is the next step to resist the flow is one thing, but then to turn it in the other direction and to support those things that go in the upward flow. So the first part is you stop the ball rolling, and you put it on pause, you might say. You hit the pause button, and then you can reorient it, and you can begin to go in the other direction. And there's an element of this, if you look in all of the yamas and niyamas. We talked about yama last week, about let's say non-violence or non-stealing or non-attachment. These sorts of things is you have to say, nope, that's where I'm going. You have to not do it. But to not do something is resistance. But every approach to life is also that, you might say, that subtle thought of catching oneself and turning, you might say, the molecule from being randomly up into the positive direction, turning the unwillingness into willingness, turning the absent-mindedness into focus, turning the restless, noticing the restlessness of the mind and calming it. All of this is tapasya. Now, even in the very smallest of actions, you see, that's tapasya. Now, and if it's resisting what's wanting to happen, a certain amount of heat is developed in that. Now, if energy is going in the right direction, there is no heat because there is no resistance to that. There's we get on the wavelength of the natural attraction, because there is a natural attraction up to pull it back. And there is no resistance to that, although Maya does have its pull and it's pulling on us, so we feel that. But we also have that, if we are perfected in our tapasya, that we don't have that heat anymore. Now, this can be expressed, as I say, in the very humblest, meanest, littlest thing. But it also is in these major, when people think of tapasya, sitting in the cold and enduring, that's, you might say, almost a symbol of what we're doing on a micro level. And some people approach life in that way to really self-discipline themselves in that way. But we don't want to think of it in that way only. It's taking something to the nth degree for those few people who have that disposition. But for all of us, there's an element of tapasya, of just resisting and turning. It's not just resisting, that's the first part, and it's also turning the energy around so that it can go back. And the natural magnetism of our upward aspiration, which is embodied in some of the other niyamas as well, will begin to take over and draw us that way. Now, Swamiji, in his commentary, spoke about tapasya in terms of it's also the ability to endure pain. And think about that. I don't want to have to do that. But every little resistance to temptation, it's painful in a sense, on a very little level. Because that impulse is there. So the ability, so Swami speaks about enduring the pain of dentistry, that's just really an image, a symbol of what is really happening with everything we do. So the ability to resist the pull of Maya, endure the pain or the heat that comes from that. And, there's that story of one of the American presidents. He had this phrase, because of a very pressure-packed job, and one of his minions or subordinates was complaining, and the president said, well, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And it's the same thing. If we can't stand suffering, get out of the suffering. Go into somewhere, we're in the wrong arena, and try to put ourselves in the right arena. Now, anyway, just to summarize, though, all of these yamas, niyamas, in the end, they're interdependent, but when they're in perfection, of course, there's the benefit that comes, the power that comes, that life, we're in a flow of grace, and each of them are testable in certain ways, which I'm going to go in next week a little bit. And it's the same thing with tapasya. It develops certain powers known as siddhis that are interesting, but we'll cover those next week when we talk about that. But you might think, well, how is virtue its own reward? How is tapasya its own reward when it seems to be resistance of pain? Well, you find that in the opposite, when we turned it, or when we actually turn our attention upward, the result is good. But in the process of doing that, it embodies some of the other qualities here. But in the process of it, act can be joyful, because God's grace comes to our aid, and we begin to, in the very process of controlling ourselves and turning that energy around, there's an aspect of divine grace in that. It's not us turning around. You see, what we're doing is we're resisting the ego's impulse to naturally go out and identify. But when the higher self, it's an element of the higher self comes in, when we resist the ego's impulse and begin to turn that around. And where there's that seed of virtue there's an element of bliss that comes in because it's the divine grace itself that comes to our aid when we recognize the need, when we recognize the desire, even the aspiration to turn ourselves in the right direction. And that, you could say, is one of the, and I'm not going in the normal order here, but one of the other elements of niyama is the fifth one. It's sometimes translated in a devotional way as devotion to the Supreme Lord, or devotion to Ishvara. But really what it implies also, it's dedication, alignment, focus, of positive aspiration toward God, that higher reality, toward pure consciousness, Ishvara. And in that focus upward, we align ourselves with grace, is what we're doing. That downward flow of energy, the upward flow of energy. If we catch ourselves in the very act of doing that, there's an element of grace. And so I think in the sense, if we find ourselves resisting some bad direction that we feel, that very impulse to resist is the seed of divine grace. And think of it that way. And bring grace and invite grace into your life. And of course, the result of that upward aspiration is we begin to open the door to God to come in. And so what happens is when we perfect that devotion, that fifth niyama, devotion to the supreme reality, love enters, we find ourselves in perfection of that. We enter upon, as it's described, the ray of divine love in which the infinite forever dwells. In other words, we gain the power to commune with God, which is an element or an expression of grace. So Tapasya embodies that. It's basically resisting the downward flow. But yes, that's only the first half of the equation. It's that other half that has to be tied into it to truly understand it. It's in the doing that and then also putting ourselves in attunement with that higher element of grace. But unfortunately, people in their that grim aspect of tapasya don't see that, but we need to bring that into it. This is what we're doing. We're turning our energy around into the other direction, and these come as a package, you might say. Now, just quickly, the other niyamas in the time allowed. Traditionally, as I mentioned, you start with cleanliness, but if we look at these, what are we really cleaning ourselves up? It's purity. Purity is the removal of those things that are impure. When we remove all of the impurities, we're naturally pure. So in other words, it's getting rid of those things that are not in their proper place. So consequently, I was a gardener for a few years, or I spent half my time actually. I was under the mentorship of a master gardener and for a couple of years, and he had an interesting saying. He says, gardening is not about growing plants. Gardening is about cultivating healthy soil. And the plant is a natural result if you have good soil. Now, that's a spiritual concept. And he said, and so I'd say, well, when I first showed up on the job there, and I would refer to soil as dirt. Well, what are we going to do with all this dirt out here? And he would get very incensed by that. He says, it's not dirt, it's soil. Dirt is what you find under your fingernails or what you sweep out of your house. We work with soil. And dirt is soil where it should not be. So you could say when we come to the niyama of cleanliness is what we're removing everything that should not be there, the impurities that should not be there. And once we remove them, then we have a perfectly pure environment. And so it's ridding ourselves of anything foreign to one's true nature. And what is that? It's the removal of ego. Anything that makes us body bound, that emphasizes that we are this body, we are this personality, we are not our true nature, which is bliss. Anything that takes us in that direction is impurity. And so when we speak of cleanliness, people think, oh, I need to be clean and take my bath every day and wash this and that. Well, no, that's good. Those are good things. But it's not on that level. How do we wash the mind? How do we wash the heart? How do we rinse it out clean? And this is what it is it's rinsing over, like you stick a dirty shirt into the water and you wring it out. Keep doing it enough times and eventually all the unpurity of that shirt is gone. And so this is what we do in our practice of spiritual practices, is we remove the impurities, those things which shouldn't be there. And so consequently, if we trace back through all of these yamas and niyamas, it's the removal of ego. Ego is behind each of these yamas and niyamas. We're not harmful because harmfulness emphasizes the ego. We don't steal because stealing emphasizes the ego. We're non-attached because attachment binds us into ego. We practice brahmacharya because sensuality emphasizes the ego, and untruth emphasizes the ego. All of these things, in the practice of them, purify us in removal of the ego, because it removes our true self. And so it removes that which obscures the true self. And what happens when the consciousness of freedom from impurity happens? It gives rise to pure love, really, which is another expression of bliss, of course. But this is spoken of in the Yoga Sutras. This is the fruit of purity. It's pure love, rather than impure. Impure colored, and what makes it impure? Now we think it's not impure because it's negative thoughts or those sorts of things. Yes, that's true, but what's behind those negative thoughts? It's something, a way of thinking that pulls us into body identification, ego consciousness. And that's what we're trying in all of these things to do. But in the process, which is the niyamas, or you might say stated more in a positive way, in the process of being pure, it need not be painful. It's in the very act of doing that. Again, we open up the door for grace to come in. If we open the door and we're aware of it, we're opening the door for grace to help us to be able to do that. So virtue, you find that in the very act of being pure, it's not a tapasya in the negative sense of pain. You find in the very act of being pure, there is a consciousness of bliss there, a consciousness of divine love. And I think this is all of these things when we're struggling on the spiritual path, and we sometimes think, oh, it's hard, it's difficult, I'm having to ascend this mountain. Try to look for, and I know I'm being idealistic in saying this, but try to look for that seed of divine grace and help within that. Because if we turn it and says, I'm suffering in all this discipline I have to do this sadhana, I have to meditate in the morning, the very act of why are you doing that is because you're not just wanting the benefits of it, but the very act of calling attention to your need to that is an opening of the door for grace to come in and help you. And if we think of it in that way, attuning ourselves to grace is what the act of spiritual aspiration is about. Love the Lord thy God, thy Father, with all thy heart, mind, body, and strength. And in the very act of thinking that and of doing that, the door is open. Now we have to develop the consciousness to feel that. If we start by just thinking in terms, God, you're with me. Thank you, God. I'm thinking of God in this very moment by wanting to aspire towards something. Now, the second one is contentment. Contentment, again, is its own reward. In being content, you enjoy that. And the fruit of it, of course, is divine bliss in perfection. But again, it's removal. Contentment isn't something, we practice being content, but when we also learn to remove that which is restless, makes us discontent, we cease reaching outside of ourselves. When we stop reaching, joy springs up spontaneously. You see, it's there already. God and grace are there already. It's just that we block it. And to the degree that we can draw down those blockages, then we open it up. And so again, contentment it's a practice, but it's also something that is an opening of the door, and it's also its own reward in that. Self-study, that absolutely important to but it again, what are we doing when we do self-study, swadhyaya? We're rooting out ego consciousness, all the ego motivations. We're being self-honest. Self-study means being totally honest and observant, turning that honesty back on ourselves, saying, no, not that, not that, not that. All those restlessness, all these, you might say, getting rid of the impurities, getting rid of the restlessness, applying the quality of tapasya to observe and resist, and to say, okay, I'm going to, in the observing it, we then apply the rooting out aspect is the self-discipline that comes with that. Self-honesty, careful observation of one's thoughts, feelings, motives, and the power that comes from that is we're able to commune with the spheres, higher spheres of existence. We detach ourselves from this physical plane. In other words, we're no longer, we're cutting, why doesn't the helium balloon rise up or the hot air balloon rise up in the air? It's because all those ropes are pulling it down, tethering it to the ground. And so in the observation and self-study and the action to release those ropes, untie those ropes, and the hot air balloon naturally begins to rise, and we don't have to put tremendous exertion to make it rise. And so this is absolutely essential to be not fool ourselves, maybe put it in the other way around, in the negative side. To self-study, don't fool yourself, and be totally self-honest about who and what we are. And it's not the ego, you see. I'm not that. I am really, looking at your true self and finding those things that are not you, removing them. And so these are all, you could say, interrelated and interdependent. And finally, coming back to this fifth one, devotion to the Supreme Ishvara, dedication. And some people don't like to use the sort of the devotional language when they study the Raja Yoga. But you could say, Ishvara is, yes, you could think of it in terms of God, but you could also think of Ishvara in terms of pure consciousness, purity in its perfected form of consciousness. Or however, total expanded awareness. But we have to have, devotion is the engagement of the heart to be able to achieve that, to love the Lord thy God with all thy body, mind, heart, and strength. And in devotion is the effort of the heart to lift itself up into the consciousness of where that devotion is felt, into that higher realm. That effort is what we call devotion, because you can be very devoted to your studies. You can be very devoted to your family. You can be very devoted to your exercise routine. It's that engagement of the full self and the heart especially to the attainment of something. And so in the process of doing that, we learn to identify with that higher self. Aspiration, maybe that's a good way. We have to be aspiring. You can't be passive. We have to be aspiring to these higher realities. And then when we do that, the divine hand, you could say, reaches down to help us, just as coming back to turning ourselves around, not just resisting, but to turning ourselves upward, looking into the light. And when we look into the light, the very nature of that, we're magnetically drawn toward it. So if you try to look to the light when you're meditating, just the effort to look to the light will begin to open the door, and eventually you'll actually start being drawn into that. But first you look, and then maintaining steadiness of purpose and engaging the heart in aspiration, so you're not passive. You then attract help. You could say the divine God, higher self, is simply waiting for us to focus on that. And that magnet, which is there all the time, then we've put ourselves into a position, into a state where we can be magnetized back to it. You know, there's a magnet. Some people are repelled by a magnet. Some people are attracted by a magnet, and some people are not affected by the magnet. Well, we are like that too. Depending upon our own inner magnetism, we have to develop some ability to respond to the magnet. We can't be passive. By looking and by turning, by focusing, by expressing, having an aspiration, saying, I'm willing. Then say, okay, I think the divine consciousness, the divine creator, and rubs his hands together, and just like Master did for Dr. Lewis, when he asked him, will you love me always as I love you? And remember, this is the first time Dr. Lewis met Yogananda, and Dr. Lewis was surprised by the question, but he thought about it. He says, yes, I will. And the Master says, good. Now I take charge of your life. And I think it's the same thing for us. That question is always there. The divine itself is asking that question, will you love me as I love you? And most people just shrug and go on. But if you stop, you say, yes, I will. And good, I take charge, and you begin to feel, you've put yourself receptive to that magnetic pull when you do that. And oops, I've gone long again. Sorry, Ashish, it's my tech today. I want to look at the chat box. I didn't get any chats today, but if you have questions, please direct them to the chat box. And I told Ashish, who is helping today, to, when the questions come in, if I don't have time to address them this week, I'm going to come back to them. Please send them to me, and we'll get them. I'll begin to address them in the weeks ahead. I know I can be a little too chatty myself, but if we get enough questions, I'm just going to maybe spend one of these weeks, next week maybe, just answering those questions or responding to your comments. And so please, it's helpful to me if you do comment. Any today? No.
And we have a couple of questions that were sent.
Okay, good.
One was earlier in your discourse where somebody asked, is renunciation also a form of tapasya? Are there any similarities?
Yeah, there is. Implied in it is, because when you renounce something, you're saying, wait a minute, I'm renouncing. Let's say renunciation is really the renouncing of ego consciousness. If we think of it, it's not, the outward forms vary, but it's basically, it's renouncing my ego identity as my ego personality being my reality, that on a higher level I'm God's child. So the renunciation, yes, of course it is tapasya, because now the implication, see, that tapasya's got a bad reputation because it stimulates certain negative feelings or thoughts in our mind. Oh my God, that's terrible. That's going to be hard. It's difficult. And I think some people play that up, and one of the one of the drawbacks of formal renunciation and formal tapasya in outer form is spiritual pride. You think that guy sitting in the sand with the little fires all around him isn't showing off a little bit? I think now in a high advanced yogi, no, that wouldn't. He's using that as an example of demonstrating. But I think the novice gets in there and says, well, I'm going to get out there too. And the bigger the crowd watching me, the better. Well, renunciation then has a certain reputation. But if we think of it in the highest sense, it's something all of us have to do. We have to resist the pull. And it's difficult. It takes no effort to roll downhill. Very little effort. You put yourself in motion and there you go. But if you want to stop rolling downhill, if you want to, like, if it's great, you get candies and sweets, it doesn't take much effort to eat them all up in the desserts. But if you have to, you see the results, and if you say, no, I'm not going to do that, then you find you're addicted. And then it takes effort to stop the addiction. So what are we addicted to? That's something I would, all of us to think about. We're addicted to all sorts of things, pleasures. We're addicted to, all the habits that we have. You could sort of say, the yogi might say we're addicted to breathing, but anything that limits us in the highest sense. And so to get rid of that addiction, to go beyond that addiction is not easy. But yet, why make it seem like it's painful or hard or things like that? It can be done with love. And in the doing of it, it's a way to invoke God's grace into our life. And I think, but there is that little element of, of discipline that comes in. Most of us don't like discipline, self-discipline or discipline from somebody else. It doesn't. But I think the wise person puts themselves under the good discipline. And why do we want to have a guru in our life, take charge of our life? That's not easy to really do, to give ourselves over to higher dharma, higher discipline. So, but I think in our deep hearts, I think all of us recognize, I need that. I need some help. And in that, there's a certain joyfulness when we submit to it willingly. And we say, yes, this is what I need. And then we approach the spiritual life in that fashion. This is joyful. And it comes, and it's not a myth. It's in the actual doing. We feel joy. Anyway, I forget what the question was. But yes, the answer is yes. I think you could say tapasya. But let's look at these things not in negative terms. Let's see them in positive terms. Turning to the light is necessary. And that's what we're saying. Renunciation and tapasya is turning to the light. Stop going in that direction and go in the better direction.
Thank you, Jayji. That was very good. The next question is also about that word tapasya. Can you please explain the difference between tapasya and titiksha? Is it always good to practice endurance even if we feel no reward for a long time?
Yeah, I think, titiksha is a particular implication of tapasya. It's a particular expression of it. But yes, it is tapasya, but it has I think it just has more of a defined meaning, an application of, whereas tapasya is a little bit more broader. It's a little bit more broader term. But without Titiksha, we don't get very far, do we? And I think you could think of it in those terms too. But of course, I think that tapasya is more is the resistance rather than the endurance. You could say it's more you're resisting that flow of impurity, and you're saying, "Stop! I'm going to reset." And then once you do reset and you get going again, then you have to have some strength to maintain that positive direction, because you see, when you say no to Maya, it's just not one time. It's in every moment that there's this, because this life is polarity. There's always a pole in one direction versus the other direction. And to be able to stick to it is implied, but you also have to recognize it. That's implied in self-study. You have to have the goal toward the positive. That's implied in the devotion to the Supreme Lord. You have to, remove those things that are keeping you from there. And that's implied in cleanliness as well, and also contentment as well. So they're all interdependent within there. And but it's a good word. Titiksha is a good word also. Okay,
A little
next
bit
week.
out of time,
Okay,
but I had one more question, but we're a little
okay,
time.
okay.
This question reads that if we are resisting to the flow of life as we are going, what about my dharma, my duty? Will I be going against my duty if I resist?
Resist the flow of life. Now, what are we resisting here? We're not resisting the flow of life. You see, now that's equating the pull into delusion as life. That's making a false comparison. I'm resisting the flow into doing my duty. Is your duty to go into delusion? Is that your duty? You think of that's your duty? No, it's not. And so wait a minute. I think we've got to start over with our definitions here, because what is our quote unquote duty? Our true one and only duty is to seek and find God. That is our duty in life. Each of us are given, we have a long journey to be able to, as it turns out, to do that. And we have infinite number of people, dispositions and abilities and characteristics. And each person has to travel their unique pathway back to God. And that is our Dharma. Now, Dharma is also a word that can be understood on all these different, because people think, oh, it's my Dharma, and they express it outwardly in some outward form. I'm a householder, I'm a monk, I'm a this or that. Yes, but that's not that's a very broad understanding. The real Dharma is turning ourselves in the right direction and following that direction to reunite ourselves with God. There are many means to be able to do that. And there are many things that are pulling us away from that Dharma, our true Dharma. And those things that are pulling us away, we have to resist those to be able to point ourselves in the right Dharma. Now that outward Dharma, now we're talking Dharma in a very broad sense here, but that Dharma has to express itself in action. Now, each of us have very different temperaments and very different karmas, and so we have to translate that into outward action of how to be able to do that. And you can't say that one person's outward method is different from another. Better or worse than another, if it's done in the wrong consciousness. It's the consciousness then with which we perform our action. And we should be basically not attached to the outward form, but to be detached in the inner attitudes of whatever it is that we are destined karmically, societally to do outwardly. So it's not an abandonment of those outward duties. It's a renunciation of the wrong attitude by which we do our outward duties. It's the renunciation of the attachments. It's the renunciation of the uncleanliness that we bring to the performance of our outward duties that need to be renounced. It's not the outward performances, because each of us have our own dharma in a particular way. And so and then you start saying, well, this one's better than that one. And that's not really true. I mean, it's not better to be this or better to be that. You could be a priest. Is that better than being a sweeper? I don't think so. You can be, in the ultimate sense, some outward duties help us to conform to the lessons we need to learn, that we're able to express that ultimate duty, which is to seek and find God. That's what and if we do that first, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added on to you. And if you seek God, your outward expressions will eventually, in the seeking of God, you actually, the outward world conforms to support you in that effort. And the circumstances will arrange themselves to allow you to do that if your desire to seek God is strong. And now it doesn't happen from 1 second to the next, and I suppose in a master maybe it would. But for all of us, our consciousness is not that strong. But if we seek, the circumstances will conform to best allow us to fulfill that dharma according to our own particular karma. So that's our duty, to renounce things that oppose that, which is attitudes, states of mind, consciousness, thoughts. That's what we mean by tapasya. Tapasya is to resist, those temptations and pull into Maya. That makes us think that one thing's better than another thing, but they are better. There is better, best than the perfect, I guess. But those are in the relative world. But really, we're talking attitudes and states of mind here, and that, or at least that's where I'm coming from, not the outward expression. So anyway, I took more time than I should have, perhaps. But let's come back. Your questions are always welcome. And as you could see, I sometimes don't hedge my opinions. So, and I don't mean to be unkind in them. So, because any question you've are asking, I got in my mind too. So, at one point or another. So anyway, let's come back next week, and we're going to continue any question. We'll go into questions answer, but we're going to continue on this theme because we haven't really discussed what happens in the perfection of the yamas and the niyamas and some of the implications there as well. So let's come back next week and continue our discussion. Joy to you.